All right, let's dive into the mind of Nicollo Machiavelli, well, I guess you could say the OG political strategist.
Mhm.
I mean, he's the guy everyone thinks of when you talk about power and those infamous Machiavellian tactics. But is it all as straightforward as his reputation suggests?
That's the big question, isn't it?
So let's set the scene. We're going back to 1513. Machiavelli, he was a high-ranking official in Florence, but then boom, political upheaval, and he's kicked out.
Exiled, sent to his farm.
Yeah, exiled. And well, I imagine he's feeling a little bitter.
I think it's safe to say he wasn't exactly thrilled about it.
No, definitely not. And that's when he writes The Prince, right?
Yeah.
This guide to power. So what's he trying to tell us? What's the secret sauce to success in his view?
Well, everything in Machiavelli revolves around this idea of virtue.
Virtue, like being a good person.
Not exactly. It's closer to skill, talent, effectiveness. It's more about having what it takes to survive and thrive in the cutthroat world of politics.
So less about morality, more about being a political ninja.
Yeah, more like that. And here's where things get tricky. Machiavelli never actually defines virtue. He uses the word like over 60 times in The Prince, but it's always a bit slippery.
So he makes us work for it.
He does. He wants us to wrestle with it, figure out what it really means to be a leader who can actually get things done in a world that's constantly throwing curveballs.
Okay, so there's this idea of virtue, but then he also talks a lot about fortuna.
Right, fortuna.
Hmm.
Luck, fate, chance. Machiavelli knew that luck plays a huge role in politics.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time, or sometimes everything falls apart no matter how carefully you plan.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Machiavelli didn't believe in just sitting back and letting fate decide your destiny. He says a leader with virtue can actually shape their own luck. They can seize those lucky breaks,
Those windows of opportunity.
Yeah, exactly, as windows of opportunity, which he calls occasione.
So it's not just about being lucky, it's about being ready to capitalize on that luck.
Right. Imagine a sudden power vacuum when a world leader unexpectedly passes away. That's fortuna. But then a savvy politician steps up, seizes the moment, skillfully maneuvers their way to the top. That's virtù and a cogione in action.
So Machiavelli's saying luck matters, but what you do with it matters even more.
Absolutely. And remember, he was writing during a time of, well, intense political instability in Italy. City-states were constantly vying for power. Alliances were shifting. Backstabbing was, pretty much standard operating procedure.
It was a dangerous game.
It was. Knowing when to seize the moment, when to make your move was critical, not just for success, but for survival.
Okay, so we have virtù, this blend of skill and opportunism, but what's the end game? What's Machiavelli's ideal leader actually striving for?
Yeah, what's the big prize?
In Machiavelli's view, it's all about mantenere lo Stato, to maintain the state.
To maintain the state. Okay, so that sounds pretty basic, right?
It might sound simple, but it's more nuanced than just holding on to power for power's sake. It's about preserving the political order, ensuring stability, and yes, even promoting the well-being of the people.
So it's like running a business. You're not just trying to keep the lights on, you're trying to grow, expand, build something that lasts.
That's a great way to put it. Now, Machiavelli identifies two big no-nos for any leader who wants to mantenere lo Stato: being hated and being despised. If you want to stay in power, you can't afford to alienate the people you rule.
Makes sense. Push people too far, and they'll eventually push back. And Machiavelli, he uses some pretty vivid examples from history to make this point, right?
He does. He talks about Roman emperors like Antoninus, who was widely hated, and Pertinax and Alexander, who were despised. All of them lost their power quickly and violently. Their lack of support, their failure to build legitimacy, it led to their downfall.
So avoiding hatred and contempt is leadership 101, Machiavellian style.
Exactly. But Machiavelli takes it a step further. Simply staying in power isn't enough. He was a true Renaissance man, right? So he also believed that a leader should strive for gloria, for glory.
Glory. So it's not just about surviving, it's about making a mark, achieving something truly great.
You got it. It's about leaving a legacy, a reputation that lasts beyond your lifetime. It's about shaping the world around you, using your virtue to not just survive, but to thrive.
Okay, so we have virtue, this blend of skill and opportunism that helps you navigate the ups and downs of fortuna. all in the service of mantenere lo Stato, but then there's this other element, right?
Right.
The whole idea of virtue, but like traditional virtue, the kind that was all the rage when Machiavelli was writing.
Exactly. We're talking justice, generosity, mercy, the classic good guy traits.
The stuff they teach you in Sunday school.
Exactly. And this is where Machiavelli really throws a wrench in the works. He challenges these head on. And this is where things get really interesting.
Okay, so Machiavelli, the exiled strategist writing this guide to power, tells us we need virtù to seize opportunities presented by fortuna in order to mantenere lo Stato.
But now we have to rethink what it means to be virtuous. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, Machiavelli argues that those traditional virtues, they should be tools, not rules. They're instruments to be used strategically, not moral imperatives that you follow blindly no matter what.
So it's not about being good for the sake of being good. It's about being effective, even if it means, bending the rules a little.
Precisely. The key question for a Machiavellian leader is always, will acting virtuously in this particular situation help me mantenere lo Stato? If the answer is yes, then by all means do it.
And if the answer is no?
Well, then, don't. Okay, that's a pretty different way of looking at things.
Right.
How does that actually play out? Let's start with justice. How does Machiavelli view this core virtue?
All right, so this is where Machiavelli really gets a reputation for being, well, a bit ruthless. His take on justice. It's perhaps his most infamous argument.
Lay it on me.
He says that a prince must be willing to break his word, to be unjust, if it's necessary for the preservation of the state. He even says, and I quote, "Experience shows that in our times, those princes who have done great things are those who have held the keeping of their word to be of no significance."
Hold on. He's saying that the most successful leaders are the ones who break their promises. That's going to ruffle some feathers.
He's definitely not preaching honesty for honesty's sake, but he's challenging this idea that a leader should always be bound by their word, no matter what the consequences.
Interesting. But does he have, any examples of this, or is it just a theoretical idea?
Oh, he has examples. He even points to the Pope.
The Pope, as someone who doesn't always keep his word.
Well, he's saying that the Pope has achieved great things, and sometimes to achieve those things, well, promises have to be, let's say, reinterpreted.
That's a bold example.
Okay.
So if he's willing to bend the rules on something as fundamental as justice, what about those other virtues, like generosity and mercy?
His views on generosity and mercy, they're a bit more nuanced. It's not about being a heartless miser or a bloodthirsty tyrant.
So it's not all bad.
No, not at all. It's about challenging conventional wisdom, using these virtues strategically.
Okay, I'm intrigued. I definitely want to hear more about that. All right, so generosity and mercy, these are big ones. I mean, they seem pretty fundamental to, being a decent human being.
Right. But Machiavelli, he wants us to look deeper.
Deeper.
Yeah, deeper. He's saying what often looks like generosity, it's actually extravagance, the kind of reckless spending that can weaken a ruler in the long run.
Okay, so not just showering everyone with gifts and favors all the time. Got it.
Exactly. More like being a shrewd investor, knowing when to hold back, when to spend strategically. Machiavelli even uses King Louis XII of France as an example.
King Louis XII, wasn't he considered pretty tight-fisted?
He was. A lot of people saw him as miserly. But his careful management of resources, well, it allowed him to wage wars without crushing his people with taxes.
So sometimes appearing stingy can actually be a sign of strength, of strategic thinking. That's pretty counterintuitive.
It is. And his take on mercy, it follows a similar logic. He argues that what we often think of as mercy, it can actually be weakness, indecision, the kind that leads to chaos and instability.
So sometimes you have to make tough calls, even if they seem harsh in the moment.
Right. It's about recognizing that a show of force, even a seemingly harsh punishment, it can actually prevent greater suffering in the long run.
Interesting. So you're saying that sometimes being merciful can actually do more harm than good.
That's what Machiavelli's arguing. He even criticizes Scipio Africanus, the famous Roman general.
Scipio, the guy known for his incredible victories and his mercy.
The one and only. And Machiavelli says Scipio's leniency, his excessive mercy, well, it ultimately led to problems down the line.
Interesting, huh? Definitely interesting. So Machiavelli's not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom. Okay, so we've got this idea that generosity and mercy, they need to be used strategically, not just blindly followed. But there's something else he mentioned earlier.
Oh, right.
Something about, reframing vices as virtues. That sounds pretty sneaky.
It is a bit sneaky. Machiavelli was a master of rhetoric. He knew how to use language to persuade, to shape perceptions.
So what's this reframing thing all about?
He calls it paradiastole. It's this ancient rhetorical technique where you basically take a vice and dress it up as a virtue.
Give me an example.
Okay, so think about how politicians today might reframe tax cuts as economic stimulus or military intervention as peacekeeping.
Ah, I see what you mean. It's all about spin, putting a positive gloss on something that might not be so positive.
Exactly. And Machiavelli, he was a master of this. He used paradiastole to expose the hypocrisy of his time, to show how what people called clemency or liberality often masked actions that were actually harmful or self-serving. He's saying, look beyond the surface. Look at the actual consequences of these actions. Don't be fooled by appearances.
That's pretty insightful.
Mm.
Okay, so we've talked about how these traditional virtues, they need to be wielded strategically. But how does this all connect back to, the big picture, to mantenere lo Stato, maintaining the state?
Right. Well, Machiavelli was especially interested in the challenges faced by what he called new princes.
New princes?
Yeah, these are the guys who come to power not through inheritance, but through, conquest or political maneuvering, or maybe even just a stroke of luck.
So not the born and bred royalty, but the upstarts, the disruptors.
Exactly. And Machiavelli believed that these new princes, they had a much harder time than those who inherited their power.
Oh.
More resistance, more threats, this constant battle for legitimacy.
It's like starting a business in a totally new market. You're up against established players. You have to fight for every inch of territory.
Perfect analogy. And Machiavelli says, in this high-stakes game, you need to build strong foundations.
Foundations.
Yeah, not just grabbing power and hoping for the best, but securing your territory, creating alliances, building institutions that'll support your rule, and of course, mastering that all-important virtue.
So it's like a giant game of chess. You're thinking several steps ahead, anticipating your opponent's moves, always ready to adapt.
You're getting it.
Yeah.
And Machiavelli doesn't shy away from the tough realities of this game. He says sometimes a new prince might need to do things that would be considered, morally questionable in other circumstances.
Okay, here come those Machiavellian tactics. The ruthlessness, the cunning, the do-whatever-it-takes mentality.
Right, but it's important to remember that Machiavelli isn't advocating for cruelty or deception for their own sake. It's always about achieving that ultimate goal. Mantenere lo Stato.
So it's all about context. What might look like a cold-blooded power grab to one person could be like a necessary act of survival to another.
Yeah, precisely. Machiavelli constantly reminds us that the world of politics, it operates by its own set of rules. It's not that traditional morality doesn't matter. It's that sometimes those rules need to be bent. Sometimes you have to make hard choices, even if they go against your personal sense of what's right, because the survival of the state, the well-being of the people you rule, that's what ultimately matters most.
So a leader's primary responsibility isn't to be good in the traditional sense. It's to ensure the survival and well-being of the state, even if that means making, some morally ambiguous choices along the way.
You got it. And that brings us back to that core tension in Machiavelli's work, the tension between conventional morality and the demands of political reality.
He's really making us think, isn't he?
He is. He's forcing us to confront this uncomfortable truth that sometimes those two things, they're in direct conflict.
A lot to process. Okay, so we've talked about those new princes facing unique challenges, the importance of virtue, this push and pull between morality and political reality. What else? What else does Machiavelli have to say about how these new leaders should operate on the world stage?
Well, this is what I find really fascinating. Machiavelli doesn't just focus on internal affairs. He says, look, you need to understand the bigger picture, the geopolitical context.
So it's not enough to just focus on your own little kingdom. You have to be aware of what's happening in the world around you.
Exactly. Machiavelli believed that a wise prince, he needs to be constantly assessing strengths and weaknesses of other states, understanding their motivations, anticipating their actions. It's like a giant game of risk.
But with real-world consequences. High stakes.
High stakes indeed. You've got to be thinking several steps ahead, forging alliances, anticipating betrayals, always having a backup plan.
It sounds exhausting.
It is. But Machiavelli, he offers some specific guidance on how to navigate this treacherous terrain. He says, for instance, a prince shouldn't just rely on one strategy.
So what, don't put all your eggs in one basket?
Exactly. You need to be able to use both force and diplomacy to achieve your goals.
So you can be tough when you need to be, but you also need to know how to negotiate, how to build relationships.
Right. And Machiavelli, he provides really practical advice on how to do both effectively. When it comes to force, he advocates for, swift, decisive action, get in, get out, minimize the damage.
So no hesitation, Straight, hard, and fast.
Exactly. And when it comes to diplomacy, Machiavelli emphasizes the importance of building strong alliances. But here's where things get tricky.
Tricky. How so?
Well, Machiavelli believed that while alliances are essential, a prince should never, ever fully trust another ruler.
Wow. That's pretty cynical.
It is. But he understood that self-interest, it often trumps loyalty in the world of politics. So you got to be prepared for betrayal. Always have an exit strategy.
Always be ready to pivot when an alliance goes sour. Okay, so force, diplomacy, alliances, anything else.
Oh, there's one more piece that's absolutely crucial. The military. Machiavelli, he believed that a prince should never, ever neglect his military.
Makes sense. If you want to be powerful, you need a strong army to back you up.
Right. And Machiavelli takes it a step further. He argues that a prince's primary focus should be on war, on developing military expertise.
Wait, really? His primary focus, not like governing or taking care of his people?
Nope. Machiavelli believed that a prince who mastered the art of war, well, he would be better equipped to handle all the other challenges of leadership.
Interesting. I mean, he was writing during a time when Italy was constantly at war, right?
He was. It was a very volatile time with all those city-states vying for power. So this emphasis on military strengths, it makes sense in that context. But he goes even further.
Further? How much further can we go?
Well, he says a prince should rely on his own troops, not mercenaries or auxiliary forces.
Because mercenaries, they're just in it for the money, right? No real loyalty.
Exactly. They're fighting for whoever pays them the most. Machiavelli says a prince's own troops, they'll be more loyal, more reliable, more invested in defending their state. They have skin in the game.
So building a strong, disciplined army is essential to maintaining power. But does Machiavelli get into, like, the nitty-gritty of warfare? Does he have any tactical advice?
Oh, absolutely. Tons of it. Everything from choosing battlefields to managing supplies to treating prisoners of war.
It's like he wrote a Renaissance-era military manual.
He pretty much did. And one of the things he emphasizes is that a prince should never hesitate to completely destroy an enemy if given the opportunity.
Wow. No mercy.
Well, it aligns with his whole philosophy of, doing whatever it takes to ensure the survival of the state.
Yeah.
But it's not just about mindless brutality. Machiavelli believed that cruelty, it should be used strategically, not gratuitously.
So it's a tool to be used carefully and deliberately.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that he also offers some surprisingly humane advice when it comes to dealing with conquered populations.
Humane. From Machiavelli. I'm surprised.
I know, right? But he argues that a prince should avoid excessive punishments, try to win over the hearts and minds of the people he's conquered.
So it's not enough to just crush your enemies. You have to find a way to integrate them into your state.
Exactly. Turn them into loyal subjects. Machiavelli understood that a stable and lasting regime, it needs more than just military might. It needs the support, or at least the acquiescence, of the people it governs.
So use force when you have to, but also know when to show restraint, when to focus on building legitimacy. It's a delicate balancing act.
It is. And this understanding of human nature, it informs his entire approach to politics. He's saying, look, you have to be realistic about people's motivations. Be prepared to, leverage those motivations to your advantage.
Wait, is he suggesting that leaders should manipulate people?
Well, he's not advocating for manipulating people for, personal gain. But he acknowledges that sometimes a leader needs to appeal to people's emotions, even their fears and prejudices, to achieve a greater good.
Okay, now this is where things get ethically tricky. It sounds like he's justifying some pretty questionable tactics.
It does, doesn't it? And this is one of the most challenging aspects of Machiavelli's work. He forces us to confront this truth, that sometimes the pursuit of power, it involves moral compromises.
So is he saying that power is inherently corrupting?
That's a big question. And it's one that Machiavelli doesn't shy away from. He understood that power is a double-edged sword. It can be used for good or for evil. It's up to each leader to decide how they'll wield it.
We've covered a lot. New princes, military strategy, deception, human nature. Anything else we need to know about how Machiavelli thought leaders should operate?
There's one more piece of the puzzle, and it's crucial to understanding Machiavelli: the power of appearances.
So it's not enough to just be powerful. You also have to look the part.
It's a bit more nuanced than that. Machiavelli believed that a prince needs to carefully cultivate his public image, project an aura of strength, confidence, even virtue.
So it's all about putting on a good show, projecting the image of a leader who embodies the qualities people admire and respect.
Exactly. Machiavelli argued that a prince should use every opportunity to, showcase his best qualities and downplay his weaknesses.
This is starting to sound a lot like modern politics, with all the spin, the image-making, the carefully crafted public personas.
It does, doesn't it? Machiavelli, he was way ahead of his time. He understood the power of symbolism, the importance of appealing to people's emotions, and the ways in which perception can shape reality.
So, a prince needs to be a master of public relations, a skilled orator, someone who knows how to work a crowd and project an image of strength and virtue.
Right, and Machiavelli even offered advice on how to do this effectively. For instance, he said a prince should be generous with, like, public displays of wealth and power, but avoid appearing wasteful or extravagant.
So walk that fine line between showing off your power and, not being totally out of touch with the people you rule.
Exactly, and he also stressed the importance of appearing pious and religiously devout.
Even if the prince isn't actually all that religious.
Precisely. Machiavelli believed that appearing to be a man of faith was essential to winning the support of the people, to maintaining a stable state. He understood the power of religious belief and how it could be used to unite and inspire people.
Another example of that tension between appearance and reality that runs through his work. It's like he's saying that sometimes projecting the right image is just as important as actually being virtuous.
That's one way to put it. And it's one of the most challenging aspects of his thinking. He forces us to ask ourselves, how much does image really matter? And where do we draw the line between projecting confidence and, engaging in outright deception?
Okay, I think we've officially reached peak Machiavellian cynicism.
Maybe so. But it's also incredibly fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It makes you think about the world of politics in a whole new way.
Exactly. And that's the beauty of Machiavelli. He doesn't shy away from these difficult questions. He challenges our assumptions, pushes us out of our comfort zones, and makes us grapple with the complexities of power and leadership.
Well, we've definitely gone deep on the Machiavellian tactics, but I feel like there's still more to uncover.
There is. Join us for part 3, where we'll look at the specific historical figures Machiavelli uses as examples, and we'll consider what his ideas mean for the world we live in today.
All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our Machiavellian adventure.
Yep, still exploring the prince.
So we've unpacked a lot of Machiavelli's ideas. Virtue, fortuna, how to use those traditional virtues, like strategically.
We even touched on that whole deception thing.
Right. But I think to really get Machiavelli, we need to look at those historical examples he uses in The Prince, right? He doesn't just, throw them in there for fun.
Oh, absolutely. These examples, they're carefully chosen. They're meant to illustrate his key points, show us how his ideas actually play out in the real world. It's like he's saying, look, don't just take my word for it. See for yourself how these principles have shaped history.
Okay, so who makes it into Machiavelli's, Hall of Fame or maybe Hall of Infamy?
Well, one of the most famous examples is Caesar Borgia, also known as the Duke Valentino.
Ah, Caesar Borgia. Now, he wasn't exactly known for being, a nice guy.
That's an understatement. He was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, and let's just say he was a ruthless and ambitious guy. Built his own power base in central Italy during a really chaotic time.
Sounds like a textbook Machiavellian prince.
Yeah.
Cunning, ambitious, willing to do whatever it takes to win.
You could say that. Machiavelli, he was fascinated by Borgia, saw him as this brilliant strategist, a master of both military force and, that shrewd diplomacy.
So Borgia was a walking case study in virtue.
Pretty much. But Machiavelli also saw the limits of Borgia's approach. He pointed out that Borgia's power, it ultimately crumbled, and it's because he relied too heavily on his father's influence, on the fact that he was, the Pope's son. When his dad died, Borgia's support network, it just vanished, and that left him vulnerable.
So even the most skilled Machiavellian prince can be brought down by, bad luck, a twist of fortuna.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that you can't control luck, but you can prepare for it, anticipate those potential pitfalls, and use your virtue to navigate those challenges.
Be ready to adapt, to pivot, to make the most of whatever situation you find yourself in.
Right. And Machiavelli uses another historical figure to illustrate this point, Agathocles, the tyrant of Syracuse.
Another ambitious, maybe morally ambiguous character.
I got it. Agathocles, he was a commoner who rose to power through sheer force of will and, let's just say ruthlessness. He famously massacred the entire Senate of Syracuse to solidify his position.
Okay, that's a bit extreme, even for Machiavelli.
It is, but Machiavelli, he's not so much interested in passing judgment, he's analyzing effectiveness. And he acknowledges that Agathocles, he achieved some remarkable things, held onto power, expanded his territory, even repelled a Carthaginian invasion.
So another example of virtue in action, even if the methods were a bit brutal.
Right. But Machiavelli points out that Agathocles' success, it wasn't built to last. He never really established legitimate institutions. He never gained the true support of the people he ruled.
So he was almost too Machiavellian, too focused on raw power, not enough on building a stable, lasting system.
That's a great way to put it. It shows that even for Machiavelli, there are limits to how far a leader can go by just relying on power and manipulation. Real virtue. It also involves building institutions, cultivating loyalty, establishing a system that can outlast you.
Okay, so we've got Caesar Borgia, the brilliant but ultimately flawed Machiavellian prince, and Agathocles, the ruthless tyrant whose success was built on, well, pretty shaky ground. Who else is on Machiavelli's list?
Oh, he pulls examples from all over. Ancient Rome, the Italian Renaissance, even biblical stories. He was really good at using history to make his points come alive.
It's like he's taking us on this tour through the history of power, pointing out the successes, the failures, the lessons we can learn from those who came before us.
Exactly. And that's one of the most valuable things about reading The Prince. It's like a guidebook, but it's also a cautionary tale. It's saying, look, even the most cunning, the most ruthless, they can be undone by their own arrogance, their inability to adapt, or just, plain bad luck.
So learn the how of power, but also understand the why and the when. And recognize that sometimes the best move is to show restraint, to be merciful, to build bridges instead of burning them.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And this is why Machiavelli's work, it's still so relevant today. It's not just some dusty old book from the Renaissance. It's this timeless exploration of the dilemmas of leadership.
The tension between doing what's right and doing what's effective, that never goes away.
Never does. The
Right.
world of politics, it's rarely black and white. It's full of gray areas, tough choices, situations where the right path, well, it's not always clear.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? Having the wisdom to navigate those complexities, make those tough calls, and keep the well-being of the state in mind, even when it means making compromises.
It's a heavy burden, but that's the nature of leadership.
Well, I think we've all gained a much deeper understanding of Machiavelli and his ideas, how they still resonate today, even centuries later.
We've explored virtue, fortuna, those controversial views on traditional virtues. We've talked about new princes, military strategy, deception, the power of appearances. It's been quite a journey.
It has, and we've seen how Machiavelli used history to show us those potential pitfalls of both, like excessive ruthlessness and naive idealism.
He really pushes us to think critically about power, about leadership, about that constant tension between morality and, well, just getting things done in the messy world of politics.
Makes you wonder what Machiavelli would say if he could see the world today.
Right. What advice would he have for leaders trying to navigate all the complexities of our modern world? Something to ponder.
It is. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our Machiavellian deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Until next time.